As Selena Carter stepped onto the plane, the familiar hum of the aircraft's engines filled the cabin, a steady, rhythmic sound that she had grown accustomed to in her years of business travel. It had been a long week of high-stakes negotiations. And now, finally, she was on her way home, taking a rare moment to exhale. The plush first-class seat, 1A, was hers, a small luxury she had earned through relentless dedication. Sleepless nights, and battles fought in boardrooms where she had to prove, again and again, that she belonged. She adjusted the strap of her sleek leather bag, feeling the comforting weight of her work materials, contracts, notes, and a tablet brimming with unfinished tasks. But for now, she just wanted to breathe. Her sharp eyes flickered across the pristine cabin, where fellow passengers settled into their seats, sipping pre-departure champagne or scrolling through their phones. This wasn't just a seat on a plane, it was a symbol of how far she had come. Selena had grown up in a world far removed from this one. A neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and the idea of first-class travel was a fantasy. But through sheer determination, she had carved a space for herself in the world of business, proving to everyone, including herself, that she was capable, that she was worthy. This seat wasn't a gift, it was a testament to the years of sacrifice and perseverance that had brought her here. She settled into 1A, sighing in quiet satisfaction as she placed her belongings neatly in the compartment beside her. Finally, a moment of peace. She adjusted her silk scarf, letting its cool fabric rest against her neck, and reached for a glass of sparkling water that a flight attendant had just placed on her tray. She hadn't even taken her first sip when she heard a sharp, clipped voice beside her. "Excuse me," came the tone, polished, but laced with an unmistakable edge of entitlement. Selena turned her head slowly, meeting the gaze of a tall blonde woman dressed in an outfit that screamed old money and privilege. Her lips were painted a perfect shade of deep red. Her manicured nails drummed impatiently against her designer handbag, and the slight wrinkle in her forehead suggested she was accustomed to getting what she wanted without resistance. The woman, who would later introduce herself as Miranda Fairchild, offered a strained smile, but her eyes were cold. "I believe there's been a mistake," she said smoothly, nodding toward the seat Selena was occupying. "This is actually my seat." Selena blinked once, keeping her expression neutral. She had been in too many rooms, too many situations like this, where someone, upon first glance, decided she did not belong. She had dealt with assumptions that she was the assistant instead of the CEO, the intern instead of the keynote speaker. And now, here she was, facing yet another attempt to erase her place in a space she had rightfully earned. Calmly, she reached into her bag and pulled out her boarding pass. "This is seat 1A, correct?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Miranda's carefully crafted smile faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. "Yes, but I'm a Platinum Elite member with the airline, and I always sit here. I think they must have upgraded you at the last minute, which is lovely, of course, but I actually need this seat." Selena's grip tightened slightly on the armrest. Ah, there it was, that unspoken assumption wrapped in a saccharine tone, that she had somehow been given something that wasn't meant for her. That she was a guest, a lucky recipient of generosity rather than the rightful occupant of the space. She exhaled slowly. "No," she said simply, handing her boarding pass to Miranda. "I booked this seat well in advance." The woman's brows furrowed, as if trying to process a reality that didn't align with her expectations. "Well," Miranda said, shifting tactics, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable in another seat. There are still a few available in business class." She offered another tight-lipped smile, as if she were doing Selena a favor. Selena let a small pause settle between them before she responded, her voice steady. "I'm perfectly comfortable right here." Miranda's lips thinned. For the first time, she was losing control of the situation, and she didn't like it. Her fingers twitched against the handle of her handbag as she turned to a passing flight attendant. "There's a mix-up here," Miranda announced, tilting her head toward Selena without making eye contact. "She's taken my seat. Could you sort this out?" The young flight attendant, a man barely in his mid-20s, hesitated. His eyes darted between the two women, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Ma'am," he said carefully, turning to Selena, "may I check your boarding pass?" Selena, still composed, handed it over without a word. The attendant studied the details. his brows drawing together. After a beat, he cleared his throat and turned back to Miranda. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is Miss Carter's assigned seat." Miranda stiffened. Her expression didn't shift immediately, but the muscle in her jaw tightened. She wasn't used to hearing, "No. That can't be right," she insisted, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. "I fly this route all the time. And I always sit in 1A. I understand, ma'am, but the seat was assigned to Miss Carter when she booked her flight. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." The flight attendant handed Selina's boarding pass back, and Selina took it smoothly, offering Miranda a small, polite smile. For a moment, the woman just stood there, struggling to process the humiliation of being denied what she assumed was hers by default. Several passengers were now glancing toward the confrontation, their interest barely concealed. Selina didn't need to say anything more. The facts spoke for themselves. Miranda exhaled sharply through her nose and forced a laugh. A brittle, humorless sound. "Well," she said stiffly, adjusting the strap of her handbag. "Enjoy your flight." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, her presence like a storm cloud retreating from view. Selina, now alone in her seat, picked up her glass of sparkling water and took a measured sip. She had nothing to prove. She had learned long ago that the best response to entitlement wasn't anger or explanation. It was simply existing in the spaces people tried to deny her. As the plane's engines roared to life, Selina Carter opened her notebook, her fingers skimming the pages filled with the details of her next big deal. Her focus remained unshaken, her presence undeniable, because this seat, her seat, was exactly where she belonged. The tension in the first-class cabin thickened like a storm cloud ready to break. Marissa Caldwell stood, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her manicured fingers tapping against her forearm as if waiting for the universe to correct what she saw as an obvious mistake. The pristine first-class seat, 1A, should have been hers. It always was. And yet, here sat Amara Whitmore, unbothered, calm, and infuriatingly resolute, as if she actually belonged there. Marissa's lips curled into an exasperated smile, one designed to mask her irritation. She exhaled sharply, her carefully curated blonde waves barely shifting under the cabin's gentle air circulation. She had made it abundantly clear to the flight attendant, there had been a mistake. And yet, instead of swiftly resolving the situation in her favor, the young man had the audacity to suggest that her rightful seat had been claimed fairly. "I don't think you understand," Marissa said, her voice tinged with condescension, as if explaining something incredibly obvious to a child. "I am a Platinum Elite member with this airline. I always sit here. I've flown this route more times than I can count. There must be some kind of last-minute mix-up. Can you double-check? Because clearly, there's been an error." The flight attendant, no more than 25, swallowed and adjusted the cuffs of his crisp uniform. He was well trained in handling difficult passengers. But there was something uniquely exhausting about dealing with someone like Marissa, someone who believed rules existed only for other people. "Ma'am," he said, maintaining an even, professional tone, "I just checked the manifest. Seat 1A was assigned to Miss Whitmore at the time of booking. There was no change or reassignment." Amara sat still, her polished fingernails resting lightly against the smooth leather cover of the notebook she had just been writing in. Her deep brown eyes remained calm, though there was a knowing edge to them, one that had been cultivated through years of being underestimated, questioned, and dismissed. She had seen this exact scene play out too many times before. The disbelief, the assumption of a mistake because someone like her couldn't possibly belong here. The thinly veiled implication that she had somehow cheated her way into this seat. And then, inevitably, the escalation. Marissa turned back toward Amara now, her expression shifting into something sharper, something teetering on the edge of hostility. She wasn't just annoyed, she was offended. Offended that this woman, this stranger, wasn't folding under the pressure. Marissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Listen," she said, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping into a confidential whisper. "There's still time for this to be handled discreetly. I know you probably got an upgrade at the last minute or maybe used miles. I don't know how you got this seat, but trust me. First class is a different experience when you actually earn your place in it." Amara's jaw tensed. There it was, the truth buried beneath layers of polite arrogance. She had seen it in corporate meetings, in boardrooms, At networking events where her credentials were ignored until she proved herself beyond a shadow of a doubt. But Amara was not here to prove herself to anyone. She already had. This seat was hers, and she wasn't going to let Marissa rewrite reality just because she refused to accept it. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I booked this seat months ago," Amara said simply, her voice cool and unshaken. "I didn't win it in a raffle. I didn't sneak in when no one was looking. I paid for it, just like you paid for yours. So no, I won't be moving." Marissa's nostrils flared. The refusal cut her deeper than it should have. It should have been simple, she should have won this argument by now. But instead, this woman, this nobody, Marissa didn't dare say it aloud, but the thought burned in the back of her mind, was standing firm, refusing to acknowledge the hierarchy Marissa had spent her whole life believing in. The surrounding passengers were now fully aware of what was happening. Some stole glances, pretending to be focused on their devices, while others openly watched, as if waiting to see how far privilege and entitlement would take Marissa before she crashed into an immovable wall. The flight attendant, sensing an impending disaster, gently cleared his throat, stepping between them. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Marissa directly, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your assigned seat. If there's an issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the airline after we land." Marissa's fingers twitched. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to being told, no. Her gaze darted around the cabin, looking for support, for someone, anyone, who might validate her frustration. But no one spoke up. No one came to her defense. Because everyone knew the truth. Amara was in the right. And Marissa? She was making a scene. With a tight-lipped, venomous smile, Marissa took a step back, forcing herself to exhale through her nose. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll remember this." Amara didn't respond. She simply held Marissa's gaze for a moment longer before turning away and reopening her notebook. As if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The dismissal, the quiet confidence in Amara's refusal to engage any further, was the final insult. Marissa had lost, not just her seat battle, but something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. As Marissa stalked down the aisle, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. The air shifted, the weight of unspoken truths hanging thick. Marissa had walked into this situation believing that her status, her privilege, her name would override the facts. But today, she had learned a different lesson. Amara's fingers traced the edge of her notebook as she finally exhaled. Steady, unbothered, victorious. This wasn't about a seat. This was about who gets to take up space in rooms that people like Marissa think they own. And today, Amara had reminded everyone watching. She belonged, just as the cabin was settling into a tense but resigned calm. A new disturbance rippled through the air like an oncoming storm. The rhythmic hum of the plane's engines, the soft clinking of glasses as flight attendants moved through the aisle, and the hushed whispers of passengers all seemed to pause in anticipation of yet another confrontation. Vanessa Hale stepped into the first-class cabin. She was the embodiment of wealth and privilege, her presence commanding attention the moment she entered. Platinum blonde hair swept up into a meticulously styled twist. A designer handbag nestled in the crook of her arm, and an air of entitlement so potent it felt as though the space around her had been reserved before she even stepped foot inside. Unlike Marissa Caldwell, who had been loud, flustered, and openly hostile, Vanessa was calculated. Every movement was deliberate, every glance carefully placed, her presence demanding immediate recognition without the need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. Her sharp, blue eyes scanned the first-class seats as though she were appraising the worth of each occupant. And then, she spotted Amara Whitmore. For a split second, her gaze narrowed, lips pursing ever so slightly before she smoothed her expression back into its usual air of detached confidence. Without hesitation, Vanessa turned to a flight attendant, her voice a mix of exasperation and amusement, as though she were making a joke at someone else's expense. "There's clearly been a mistake," she said, nodding towards Amara's seat. "I always sit here." The flight attendant, a man in his mid-30s with a look of exhaustion already creeping into his features, forced a smile. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass?" Vanessa sighed, as if this were an unnecessary formality, and retrieved a pristine leather case from her handbag before handing over the ticket. The flight attendant's eyebrows lifted slightly as he scanned it. then flipped through his tablet to confirm the assigned seats. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "but your seat is actually 2C, not 1A." A sharp chill settled into the space between them. Vanessa's expression didn't falter, but a dangerous glint flashed behind her eyes. "That can't be right," she said, her voice remaining eerily pleasant, though a warning edge had crept in. "I have been a Premier Elite member with this airline for over 15 years. I never sit anywhere but seat 1A. So please, double-check." Amara had been quietly observing the exchange, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest. But at Vanessa's pointed insistence, she finally looked up. Their eyes met. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but there was something unmistakable in the way she examined Amara, a subtle, quiet judgment that wasn't spoken aloud but was felt. Thick and suffocating. Amara recognized that look. She had seen it in corporate meetings, networking events, and luxury spaces where people like Vanessa assumed she didn't belong, where her presence was always questioned first. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about power, and who deserved to have it. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant repeated, his voice growing tighter, "but Miss Whitmore is in the correct seat. There hasn't been a mistake." The use of Amara's last name made Vanessa's lips twitch, her pleasant facade slipping for just a second. Then, she turned to Amara directly, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you'd be far more comfortable in another seat," Vanessa said sweetly. "Wouldn't you prefer extra space? Perhaps an aisle seat instead?" Amara didn't blink. "No," she said simply. "I prefer this seat. That's why I booked it." The smile on Vanessa's face froze, her fingers tightening against the handle of her designer tote. She wasn't used to being told no. Not in restaurants, not in hotel upgrades, and certainly not on flights where she was used to being treated like royalty. Vanessa let out a light laugh, shaking her head slightly, as if Amara had just made a silly mistake that needed correcting. "You probably don't know this," Vanessa continued, tilting her head slightly, "but for passengers with my status, we're generally given priority seat selection. So while you may have purchased your ticket, this seat is." Amara's voice cut through the air like a blade. "This seat," she said firmly, "is mine." Vanessa stiffened, her smile vanishing completely. A quiet ripple of tension spread through the cabin. Other passengers, though pretending to be immersed in their devices, were listening closely now. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where a supervisor had begun to make her way over. Sensing the escalation, Vanessa, realizing she was losing control, tried one last tactic. Her voice lowered, taking on a more insidious edge. "I'm only trying to make this easier for both of us," she said softly. "These things have a way of sorting themselves out. Are you sure you want to make this difficult?" It was a thinly veiled threat, the kind that wasn't overtly hostile, but dripped with implications. Amara's gaze didn't waver. Her heart thudded once, hard in her chest, but not from fear, from something deeper, from years of being told to move aside, from decades of being forced to make space for others. And she was done. So, Amara closed her notebook with a soft, deliberate snap. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice low but unyielding. "You don't intimidate me, Mrs. Hale," Amara said, "and I'm not moving, so if you'd like to keep escalating, be my guest, but I assure you, it won't go the way you think it will." The weight of her words landed heavily in the space between them. For the first time, Vanessa hesitated. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, not just frustration, but uncertainty. The supervisor finally arrived, stepping into the conversation with an air of finality. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice carrying authority, "Seat 1A belongs to Miss Whitmore. I'm afraid you'll need to take your assigned seat immediately." Vanessa's jaw clenched, but the game was over. She had lost. With one last withering look, she turned sharply on her heel and marched back down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor like the sound of defeat. Amara let out a measured breath, steadying herself. She had won this battle. Not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she knew, deep down, this was far from over. The air inside the conference room felt suffocating, thick with an unspoken tension that clung to every corner like an unwelcome shadow. Evelyn Carter sat at the long, polished mahogany table, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles pale, The glow from the large chandelier above cast an artificial warmth over the room. But she felt cold, cold in a way that seeped past her skin and into her bones. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, sacrificed sleep, relationships, and her own well-being to build something extraordinary. Yet, as she looked around the room at the people she once considered allies, she realized that everything was slipping through her fingers like sand in an unforgiving tide. At the head of the table sat Richard Vaughn, the CEO of Titan Enterprises, the very company Evelyn had poured a decade of her life into. His expression was unreadable, but the gleam in his sharp eyes sent a chilling message. He had already made up his mind. Next to him sat Victoria Hale, the woman Evelyn had trusted, confided in, and mentored, now sitting on the other side of the table, ready to rip away everything Evelyn had built. The betrayal burned like acid in her stomach, but she swallowed down the pain. This was not the time for emotion. "Evelyn," Richard began, his voice calm but carrying an air of finality. "We appreciate all that you've done for Titan Enterprises. Your dedication has been admirable. Truly. But after careful deliberation, we've decided that the company needs to move in a new direction, one that doesn't involve you as part of the executive team." Evelyn inhaled sharply, her pulse pounding against her ribs. She had expected resistance, had braced herself for a difficult conversation. But this? A complete dismissal? The betrayal was so blatant, so ruthless, that it took her a moment to process the words. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was measured, but there was an underlying fire that no one in the room could ignore. "A new direction?" she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Richard, let's not sugarcoat this. You and I both know what's happening here. You're not pushing the company forward, you're pushing me out." A hushed silence fell over the room. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, refusing to meet Evelyn's gaze, while several board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the truth. They knew that Evelyn had been the backbone of the company, that her strategies had secured multi-million-dollar deals, that it was her vision that had taken Titan Enterprises to the forefront of the industry. Yet, they remained silent, complicit in the corporate coup unfolding before them. Richard leaned back in his chair, a rehearsed sigh escaping his lips. "Evelyn, we're offering you a generous severance package. Consider this a way for you to step away with dignity." Dignity. The word made her stomach twist. They wanted her to walk away quietly, to disappear without a fight, to let them win. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "Dignity?" she echoed, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "You think stripping me of my title, my years of hard work, my leadership, is dignified? No, Richard, what's happening here is theft, calculated, deliberate theft. You're taking everything I built and handing it to people who didn't do the work, didn't make the sacrifices." Victoria's face darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Evelyn, business is business. Sometimes, changes are necessary." Evelyn turned to her, eyes blazing. "Yes, changes are necessary. But betrayal? That's a choice. And you chose it the moment you decided to stand against me instead of beside me." A flicker of guilt passed over Victoria's face, but she masked it quickly. Richard exhaled, pushing the documents toward her. "Evelyn, sign the papers. You have until the end of the day to make your decision. The sooner we finalize this, the better for everyone. For everyone." As if she was just another replaceable part in the machine. Evelyn looked at the papers in front of her, the bold letters spelling out her termination. She had given them everything. And now, they were giving her a pen and a line to sign away her legacy. No, she wouldn't let them write her ending. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the papers back toward Richard. The room seemed to hold its breath. "You want me gone? Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But don't think for a second that I'll walk away quietly. I built this company. I built relationships with investors, with clients, with the media. And trust me, when I leave, I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of people you are." A murmur rippled through the room. Even the most silent board members shifted in their seats. Richard's jaw tightened. "Evelyn, be reasonable." "I am," she interrupted. "I'm being very reasonable. And I suggest you prepare yourself. Because you may have taken my position, but you will never take my influence." With that, Evelyn stood, smoothing out her blazer. She had walked into this room believing she had lost everything. But now she realized the truth. Titan Enterprises wasn't her power. She was her power. And they had just made the worst mistake of their lives by underestimating her. As she strode toward the door, her heart pounded with purpose. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. If you believe in standing up for yourself, in fighting for what's right, hit that like button and show your support for Evelyn. Drop a comment below to encourage her as she takes on this next chapter. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, courage, and triumph, because this is just the start. The tension in the first-class cabin had settled into an eerie stillness. The kind that lingers right before a storm breaks. Amara Brooks sat in her seat, her back straight, her hands resting calmly on the armrests. But her mind was anything but still. Across the aisle, Vanessa Hale, with her platinum blonde hair and designer attire, still fumed, her hands gripping the edges of her tray table, her frustration practically radiating off her in waves. The flight attendants hovered nearby, their nervous glances flickering between the two women like they were waiting for a final verdict. But Amara wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to engage in a war of words with someone who had already shown their entitlement outweighed their logic. Instead, she did something that changed everything. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone, the soft hum of the airplane's engines masking the faint click of a button as she dialed. The cabin crew had been so fixated on Vanessa's performance, on her loud demands and exaggerated gestures, that they had forgotten something crucial. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes, real power is quiet, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Marcus, Amara said, her voice smooth and unwavering. I need you to handle something. The moment she spoke the name, the nearest flight attendant stiffened. The color drained from his face just enough for Amara to notice. She could already tell, he recognized it. Marcus Foster wasn't just anyone. He was the senior vice president of corporate affairs for this airline. A man whose authority went beyond this flight, beyond these attendants, and most certainly beyond Vanessa Hale's misguided belief that her wealth made her invincible. A ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Vanessa, who had been smugly preparing for another argument, tilted her head slightly, watching Amara with something close to curiosity, but also with the first flickers of doubt. Yes, Amara continued, glancing at the nameplate on the closest flight attendant's uniform. I'm on flight 412 to Oslo. There's a problem with how some of your staff are handling a situation. I'd like it addressed before we take off. A hushed silence fell over the passengers closest to her. No one had expected this shift. No one had expected Amara to hold the kind of influence that didn't require raised voices or threats, just a simple phone call. The flight supervisor, Diana Lang, took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Brooks, she began, her voice suddenly more careful. I assure you, we are doing our best to accommodate. Amara held up a single hand. She wasn't interested in meaningless reassurances. No, Diana, she interrupted, her voice carrying the effortless authority of someone who had fought for every inch of respect she had earned. You were doing your best to accommodate her. She gestured subtly toward Vanessa. At my expense. But now, you'll be accommodating me, because I want you to understand something very clearly. I don't play games. And I certainly don't let people like her decide whether I belong in a seat I paid for. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, a flash of uncertainty breaking through her carefully crafted mask of arrogance. The rest of the cabin held its breath. Even the passengers who had initially pretended not to notice were now fully engaged, their eyes flicking between Amara and the flight crew, waiting to see how this played out. A soft chime broke the silence. The lead flight attendant's communication device buzzed on his hip. He glanced at it, swallowed hard, and quickly turned to Diana. His voice was quiet, but Amara caught the faint urgency in his tone. Corporate is on the line. Diana paled. She nodded stiffly before stepping toward the galley, speaking in hushed tones into her earpiece. Whatever she heard made her back straighten, her fingers tightening around the device as she finally turned back toward Amara. We apologize for the misunderstanding. Miss Brooks, Diana said, her voice suddenly devoid of the earlier condescension. There is no issue with your seat. And of course, you are welcome to remain where you are. There will be no further discussion on this matter. Vanessa let out a choked laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. You can't be serious. Diana's gaze barely flicked toward her. Mrs. Hale, if you are unhappy with your seating arrangement, We will be happy to assist you in rebooking a later flight." The stunned look on Vanessa's face was almost comical. Almost. But Amara didn't smile. She wasn't here for revenge. For petty satisfaction. She was here to remind people like Vanessa, and the airline itself, that respect is not optional. Vanessa sputtered, scrambling for a way to regain control. But it was over. Amara had turned the entire situation on its head. And now, Vanessa wasn't the woman in charge. She was the woman who had underestimated the wrong person. Diana turned back to Amara. Her tone more cautious now. "Miss Brooks, if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let us know." Amara simply nodded. "I'll let you know if I need anything. For now, I'd just like to enjoy my flight in peace." The flight attendants hurried away, their postures stiffer, more rigid, as they scrambled to undo the mess they had made. The weight of corporate oversight now loomed over them like an unspoken warning. Vanessa was left to stew in her seat, her jaw clenched so tightly that Amara almost thought she might crack a tooth. And just like that, the flight resumed as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Amara had won, not just the seat, not just the argument, but the respect that she had been denied the moment Vanessa assumed she didn't belong. And to those who were watching, who had seen what unfolded and felt something stir in their own chests, a sense of injustice, of recognition, this was for them too. Because how many times had they been asked to move? To make themselves smaller? To justify their place in a space they had every right to occupy? Not this time. Not today. If you believe in standing your ground, in knowing your worth, and in refusing to be pushed aside by entitlement, show your support in the comments. Let's hear it. Where are you watching from? Have you ever faced a moment like this? Let's remind the world that respect isn't given based on status or wealth, it's earned. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe for more empowering stories, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because this is how you take your power back. The cabin had never been quieter. The hum of the engines filled the thick air. But no one was speaking, not the passengers, not the flight attendants, not even Vanessa Hale, who now sat stiffly in her seat, her face drained of the arrogant confidence she had worn like a shield. The only movement came from the corporate representatives who had arrived, their crisp suits and serious expressions signaling one thing: the reckoning had begun. Diana Lang, the flight supervisor, stood frozen near the galley, her fingers twitching by her sides as she watched the two men approach. Tom, the flight attendant who had initially tried to mediate the situation but had failed spectacularly, was shifting uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. "Miss Lang," the taller of the two representatives said, his voice carrying an air of finality that sent a chill down her spine. "We've reviewed the situation." Diana swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Sir, but the man lifted a hand, silencing her before she could say anything more. "Your conduct has been deemed inappropriate and inconsistent with company policy." His words were calm, measured, but they might as well have been bullets the way they hit her. For years, Diana had prided herself on her ability to handle difficult passengers, to maintain order, to keep first class running like a well-oiled machine. But she had miscalculated. She had prioritized the wrong person. She had backed Vanessa Hale, a woman whose entitlement knew no bounds, over Amara Brooks, a woman who had every right to her seat, her respect, and her dignity. And now she was going to pay for it. Tom's voice cracked as he stepped forward, desperation leaking into his words. "It was a misunderstanding. We were just trying to de-escalate." The second representative, an older man with steel gray hair and eyes that had clearly seen a lifetime of people trying to talk their way out of trouble, simply shook his head. "Mr. Calloway," he addressed Tom, his tone making it clear there would be no saving grace. "De-escalation does not mean disregarding a paying customer's rights in favor of someone louder." Tom's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "We didn't mean. This is not a discussion." The taller representative cut in, his voice sharp as glass. "Effective immediately. Both of you are being removed from duty. Further disciplinary action will be determined upon landing." Diana swayed slightly, her head spinning. Removed? Mid-flight? This wasn't just a warning or a slap on the wrist. This was public humiliation. She had spent years building her career, ensuring that she was seen as authoritative, respected, and now, All of it was being stripped away in a matter of minutes. Please collect your things, the older man instructed. You'll remain seated in the rear jump seats for the remainder of the flight. Security will escort you from the aircraft upon arrival. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Tom looked like he wanted to argue, to fight back, but one glance at the cold, unyielding faces of the representatives told him there was no use. His shoulders sagged. Diana, for all her pride, didn't speak. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Across the aisle, Amara Brooks finally looked up from her notebook, her eyes flickering over Diana and Tom with an unreadable expression. She had not demanded retribution, had not thrown a tantrum the way Vanessa had not even asked for anything other than to be treated with the respect she had already earned. And yet, the weight of her presence alone had shifted the entire balance of power on this flight. Vanessa, still clinging to her last shred of defiance, scoffed loudly. This is ridiculous. You're removing them? For what? For trying to accommodate a loyal customer? One of the representatives turned to her with an expression of sheer indifference. Mrs. Hale, he said, I'd recommend you remain seated and silent for the rest of the flight. The warning in his voice sent a ripple through the cabin. Even Vanessa, who had spent the entire ordeal believing she was untouchable, snapped her mouth shut. The walk of shame began. Diana and Tom, once the ones wielding power over first class, now had to shuffle to the back of the plane under the silent, watchful eyes of every passenger who had witnessed their failure. The sound of their footsteps against the carpeted floor was deafening in its own way. No one spoke, no one pitied them. By the time they reached the rear jump seats and buckled in, they were no longer the authoritative figures they had been at the beginning of this flight. They were just two employees who had made a choice, and now had to face the consequences. For the first time since boarding, Amara allowed herself a breath of relief. She hadn't sought revenge, hadn't needed to be vindictive. The truth had been enough. Her presence had been enough. And now, sitting comfortably in the seat she had always rightfully occupied, she felt something settle deep in her bones. She hadn't just won a seat. She had won a battle far bigger than this flight. The other passengers, many of whom had watched silently, seemed to finally exhale. Some offered Amara small nods of acknowledgement. Others simply returned to their books, their movies, their glasses of champagne. But the energy had shifted. Something had changed. Respect had been demanded, and respect had been given. As the engines roared and the plane finally lifted off, Amara leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. She had made her point, and no one on that flight would ever forget it. The cabin door had closed with a sharp, resolute hiss, cutting off any chance of reversing the decision that had just been made. The murmurs of the passengers had settled into a hushed, expectant silence, their gazes flicking between the first-class aisle and Vanessa Hale, who sat stiffly in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Vanessa had spent her entire life believing that the rules did not apply to her, that money, status, and power could bend any situation to her will. But today, that belief was crumbling around her, dissolving into a reality she could not control. Across the aisle, Amara Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the start, settled in her rightful seat, exuding an air of quiet, unshakable confidence. She had not raised her voice, had not stooped to the level of entitlement and tantrums that Vanessa had so effortlessly indulged in. And yet, it was Amara who had won. A sharp click of heels against the cabin floor drew all eyes toward the approaching corporate representative. A tall woman with short, silver-streaked hair and an expression so unreadable it sent a shiver down Vanessa's spine. Beside her stood two uniformed security officers, their presence alone enough to send a message that could not be ignored. Mrs. Hale, the representative began, her voice as smooth and controlled as a blade against glass. We have reviewed the situation. And based on your conduct, the airline has made a decision. Vanessa bristled, sitting up straighter in her seat. I hope that decision involves disciplining your staff for their incompetence. She sneered, her voice edged with false bravado. The representative did not flinch. Your behavior today has been deemed unacceptable. She continued without pause, effective immediately. Your Premier Elite membership status has been revoked. A stunned silence swept through the cabin, heavy and absolute. Vanessa's body went rigid, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. You can't be serious, she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The representative didn't blink. This decision is final. The words hit Vanessa like a slap across the face. For years, her elite membership had been more than just a privilege. It had been a symbol of status, of importance, of power. It meant access to the best lounges, priority boarding, free upgrades, exclusive treatment. It meant she was seen, that she mattered. And now, it was gone. The weight of that realization crashed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. Vanessa let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking her head. This is ridiculous. You can't just strip me of my status over one misunderstanding. The corporate representative's eyes remained steely. It was not a misunderstanding, Mrs. Hale. It was a deliberate display of entitlement at the expense of another passenger's rights. This airline does not tolerate behavior that disrupts the experience of our customers. Nor does it prioritize status over dignity. Vanessa turned sharply toward Amara, as if expecting her to intervene, to protest, to somehow undo what was happening. But Amara did nothing. She simply met Vanessa's gaze, her expression unreadable, her power lying in her silence. That silence spoke volumes. Vanessa's breath came in short, shallow bursts, her vision tunneling as panic clawed its way up her throat. This isn't over, she spat, though the words felt hollow. Desperate. I'll go to corporate. I have connections. The representative exhaled lightly, as if she had heard the same tired excuse 100 times before. Corporate is already aware, she stated coolly. Then, with a glance at the security officers, she gave the final order. Please escort Mrs. Hale from the aircraft. The sentence fell like a gavel hitting the bench of a courtroom. Vanessa's eyes widened in horror. You're removing me? She gasped, her voice rising, raw with disbelief. You can't be serious. Passengers exchanged glances, some casting fleeting expressions of pity, others satisfaction. The woman who had spent the entire flight demanding recognition, demanding privilege, was now being shown the one truth she had never been willing to accept. Her status did not make her untouchable. The security officers stepped forward, their presence alone forcing Vanessa to move. She grabbed onto the armrests, resisting, her pride too great to allow her to be dragged away like a criminal. I'll sue, she hissed. I'll destroy this airline. No one responded. Instead, the officers simply gestured for her to stand. Shaking with rage, Vanessa slowly rose to her feet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her breathing was erratic, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. She turned one last time toward Amara, her lips parting, searching for some final, stinging remark. But Amara had already turned away. That, more than anything, was the final blow. Vanessa had been dismissed. Without another word, she allowed herself to be escorted down the aisle, her designer heels clicking against the cabin floor in a sound that echoed louder than before. The first-class passengers, who had once been her audience, now refused to meet her gaze. Even Lydia, her once loyal friend, had shrunk into her seat, avoiding eye contact, her fingers gripping the in-flight magazine like a lifeline. The flight attendant stood still, silent, watching, and then, with one last defiant huff, Vanessa Hale disappeared beyond the cabin doors. The moment the door sealed behind her, the energy in the plane shifted. A collective exhale rippled through the cabin, as if a storm had finally passed, leaving only the remnants of its destruction in its wake. For the first time since the flight began, Amara allowed herself to relax, to take in a deep breath, to let the tension that had coiled in her muscles slowly unravel. She reached for her notebook again, flipping it open, her focus shifting back to what truly mattered. Because, unlike Vanessa, Amara had never needed validation. She had never needed to prove her worth through status or demands. She had simply needed to stand her ground. And she had. And now, everyone in that cabin, everyone who had watched and waited and judged, knew exactly who she was. The flight had landed, but the ripples of what transpired at 30,000 feet were only beginning to spread. As passengers disembarked, whispers filled the air, some hushed, others bold. Amara Brooks remained seated for a moment longer, watching as the crew, now humbled, avoided her gaze. She had not raised her voice, nor had she demanded attention. Yet, she had commanded the situation with an authority no amount of privilege or status could override. Outside the aircraft, the corporate team awaited her arrival. the head of airline operations. An older gentleman with silver hair and tired eyes extended a hand. Ms. Brooks, I deeply regret today's events. This is not the kind of experience we want any of our passengers to have. Amara studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. Regret is one thing, she replied, her voice steady. Change is another. I trust this will not be swept under the rug? The executive nodded solemnly. I can assure you it won't. True to his word, within the week, the airline released an internal memo detailing new diversity and inclusivity training, stricter disciplinary measures for discrimination, and a policy revision for handling passenger disputes. The statement didn't mention the flight directly, but those who had witnessed it knew exactly what had prompted the sudden shift. Beyond the flight, a ripple effect. Amara's experience became a catalyst for deeper conversations. News of the incident made its way through corporate circles, igniting discussions about the quiet biases that often go unchecked. It wasn't just about a seat, it was about entitlement, respect, and the unconscious barriers placed before those who don't fit an expected mold. At a leadership conference weeks later, Amara found herself approached by a young woman, her hands shaking slightly as she introduced herself. Ms. Brooks, I was on that flight. Amara tilted her head, surprised. Oh, I just wanted to say thank you. The woman swallowed hard, emotion thick in her voice. I've been in situations like that before. Times when I should have spoken up but didn't. Watching you handle it so calmly, so powerfully, it made me realize that silence isn't an option anymore. Amara reached out, squeezing the woman's hand. It never was. But now you know, and that's what matters. Lessons to live by. This story isn't just about Amara, or even about that flight. It's about every moment in life when someone is made to feel small, unwelcome, or unworthy simply because of someone else's assumptions. It's about the power of standing firm, of knowing your worth, and refusing to let someone else define it for you. Respect isn't about status, it's about integrity. You don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it through how you treat others, especially those who can do nothing for you. Power is not in the title, but in the way you carry yourself. Amara didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to argue to win. She let her presence and principles do the speaking for her. Justice isn't always loud, but it is relentless. Small actions create change. A refusal to give up a seat turned into a corporate policy shift. Never underestimate the impact of one moment of courage. Entitlement is fragile. The woman who thought she could demand what wasn't hers left the flight with her status revoked. Those who believe they are above others often find themselves falling the hardest. Your voice matters, join the conversation. What would you have done in Amara's situation? Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to stand your ground against entitlement? Comment below and share your thoughts. Your stories deserve to be heard. If this story inspired you, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of resilience, justice, and empowerment. Together, we can ensure these conversations continue, and that respect remains non-negotiable for everyone. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.